Good evening. I'm Malcolm Young, the Dean of Grace Cathedral, and welcome to the forum. Thanks for joining us online. In September, it will be the 10th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. And while inequity and inequality continue to be on the rise, that nonviolent protest helped shape the way people think and talk about inequality. My guest tonight is Judith Butler, Maxine, Elliot Professor Emeritus in UC Berkeley's Department of Comparative Literature and the program of Critical Theory. She is the author of the groundbreaking work Gender Trouble, and in her most recent work, The Force of Nonviolence, she argues that our times, or perhaps all times, call for imagining an entirely new way for humans to live together in the world, a world of what she calls radical equality. In keeping with Grace Cathedral's theme of healing this year, the year of healing, we're going to talk about how this radical idea might help heal our divided world. Judith, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I didn't tell you, but I have one of my most vivid memories of being a graduate student in like 1992 or 93 or something like that. And I was standing outside of Rockefeller Hall with a bunch of other graduate students. And we were talking, each of us had our own like little book manuscript projects that we were working on. And I remember one of my, David Kayumon Kim said to me, he said, what he wanted most was to be published like you were published for Gender Trouble by Rutledge University, by Rutledge Press, and have that kind of impact. And it's so strange. I mean, I must have had, I mean, what else can I remember of a conversation from that year? But something really sunk in for me. And I'm so grateful that you're able to be here tonight.
Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm glad to confirm that David Kim has done very well and is very well published and very highly respected, and that sometimes when we're younger, publication looks like an inachievable task, but it can happen, and it does happen, and it's important that students and graduate students imagine that this is a world they can enter. It's been tough, as you know, because higher education has suffered, and the chances for graduate students in the humanities these days are not what they were. So on the one hand, one wants to encourage. On the other hand, one wants to be realistic and not produce a fantasy of what is possible. Anyway,
yeah. I have David's book on my bedside table, and I can't wait. I mean, it's almost like I've been saving it just to be able to enjoy it more. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what surprises you the most over these years of accomplishments. I mean, what surprises you most about your life as you kind of look back on all these things over the years?
Well, I'll tell you, Malcolm, I'm actually very grateful because, I like to tell this story. When I was young, I was in my early 30s, and I published these books, and people were going around saying, well, Butler believes this, and she believes that. And I'm sort of a she, they now, but at the time I was she. And I would want to run after them and say, no, that's not exactly what I meant. No, it was more like this. It was more like this. Correct and qualify, make sure everybody understood. And now, whatever they say is actually very interesting and very wonderful, especially when it's in other languages and it comes back to me in a quite significantly strange form. Like, oh, this is how it's read in this language. So it's kind of a gift that comes back. It's a new text. It's a different set of ideas. It's maybe not the ones that I had, but it's the ones that others came up with through reading me. And it's very generative, and I learned from it, and I really am quite grateful.
Yeah, I love that idea that after the work leaves your hand, it goes out into the world, and other people make what they will of it.
Yeah, you don't own it anymore.
You don't own it anymore, exactly.
And indeed, you never owned it.
Do you have any examples of particular interpretations or uses of your work that pleased you in particular?
I think what pleases me most is the protest movements that have found some alliance in what I wrote, because some of what I wrote was surely seeking to establish alliance with them. So that becomes an interesting kind of reciprocity. I mean, even Gender Trouble, I was very attuned to what was happening in gay and lesbian politics and in feminist politics, and responding to those movements and registering some of the ideas that were generated in those movements in my own academic way and text. But then you see that the academic text kind of re-enters the street or the movement and becomes something else and is enlivening or activating for others. So, that's a beautiful kind of exchange.
Yeah, that was one of my, and there's so many like little things that I have in my head because I've been studying to have you on tonight. But somewhere that's one of the things you mentioned, just like that community of activists, gay and lesbian activists in the 80s that were like so important to you. And I just wanted to hear more about those people, because I can imagine I just having, from my memories of that time, the energy and the electricity around those matters. It became such a life and death issue and such a massive cultural change. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the community of people, like who your friends were, and what were the people who kind of informed, some of these ideas.
Well, I suppose that I was thrilled to go to college and realize that there were other people who were gay or lesbian or bisexual, and even trans, some people at that point. And I felt less alone. I think in high school, it was me and Sappho and, nobody in between.
Yeah.
So it was not so easy. And I felt the weight of pathologization and stigmatization, and had some real fear and anxiety as a young queer kid. So college was exciting, but New York was exciting too, maybe more so. And I lived part-time in New Haven and part-time in New York. And then I eventually moved to Washington for a while. And I was, and then when I came to San Francisco, I was part of the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission.
Right, of course. That was important work.
Did that board for a year or two. But those were great discussions. In Washington, I was part of a lesbian activist group called LIPS. We never knew what it stood for, but
it didn't really need to stand for anything. It's perfect just the way it is.
It was good enough. And we would go to the Supreme Court and make noise, and that was all great. But I have to say also that in the women's centers or in the bars of New Haven, I learned what people felt and thought and what they desired for their lives, and the sorts of suffering they had experienced or continued to experience. And I became aware, I believe, of just how deeply people are oppressed when they do not conform to gender norms that are considered acceptable. And, this happened for a wide number of people, no matter what their background was. They could have liberal parents, they could have conservative religious parents, they could have radical secular parents. These norms had a kind of power that instilled fear in many people. If you did not conform, you would be punished, or you would be stigmatized or isolated. So I felt very lucky that I was able to make community with a number of people who have been part of my life. I read people like Gail Rubin. I read the French lesbian writer Monique Wittig. I certainly read everything that the feminists at the time, Gloria Steinem and others, were writing. Even in high school, I was reading Gloria Steinem, I believe, and who was just a bit ahead of me, maybe a decade or so. And that was really important. And to learn that one could make an intellectual life as well, and even fight for a place in the academy. I remember early on, George Chauncey, the historian, was very clear. We're going to have lesbian and gay studies. I was like, really? Can we have that? Or Carolyn Dinshaw said, we're going to have queer studies. I said, oh, we can't use the word queer. That's just. But, I was part of a group of people who drove around New England. Whenever Audre Lorde was speaking, we were there.
Oh, of course.
Saturday in Boston. So off we went. And same with Adrienne Rich.
Oh, yes, of course.
Really,
of course. Yeah, it's so interesting because there was such a concentration of people. And, I think some of your work I think one of the most powerful thing is when a writer writes something that is so revolutionary that years later it just seems so obvious. And I felt that way about just like your criticisms of the women's movement, that everybody should have been noticing that in 1986. And yet you're the first person who I can think of who is making some of those criticisms that I encountered. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just your relation to the women's movement and in your connection and the way that you kind of advance things for how we look at those issues.
Well, I guess I have to differ and just say that these were live debates within the women's movement. We define women by virtue of their maternity, their capacity to give birth. Are women more caring than men? Do women have a separate set of moral values than men? And most of those questions presumed that there were women who were more or less uniform, and then there were men who were more or less uniform. And that turned out to be a pretty bad assumption, given the wide range of gender experiences, the uncaring women, the maternal men, the
overbearing father, and the overly sensitive father, and it's those kind of just huge generalizations were so much part of the air that we breathed. One of the questions I had to ask was, I think there are ways in which things are getting better for LGBTQ plus people, and the ways that things are getting worse. And I just wonder what you have to say about that in terms of just what it felt like in 1986 and what things feel like in 2021.
Well, it always depends what time and place we're in. If you're talking about New York City and San Francisco, are you talking about Tennessee? Are you talking about Des Moines, Iowa? Are we in the Southwest, or are we outside the United States? In some places, things are getting better because there are new legal rights and legal protections. At the same time, I've experienced in recent years a backlash against the legal progress of feminism, of LGBTQIA people's interests and issues. People talk about a resurgent homophobia or a resurgent misogyny, and it is that for sure, there's no question, but it's also very much a response to these progressive movements on the part of those who are alarmed. Gay marriage, the right to reproductive freedom, abortion, the rights to adoption on the part of gay and lesbian people. These have been scandalizing, and scandalizing in all kinds of countries like France, like Switzerland, but also throughout Latin America and in certain parts of Eastern Europe and in certain parts of Africa. It's been quite a struggle lately to see how these political and legal advances have been attacked, and how many reactionary groups are forming and linking together to defeat what they call gender ideology, or lesbian, gay, queer politics, and seek to restore us to a kind of biological essentialism that fits rather neatly with an idea of the family that is exclusively heterosexual and bound together through conventions of marriage.
What I love about what you're saying is I mean, this is so obvious to you because you're living your life, but you must be such a lightning rod, like kind of a symbol for so much. And I wonder just how that's been just in the era of just having this, the internet where we're in social media. And I just wonder what that feels like to be to be a symbol of so many big things. And I always thought of it on the kind of the positive side of symbol of liberation, but I can imagine that some of those movements would demonize you. And I just wonder what that feels like. I'm not very much in the public eye relative to you, but like the little bits that I get are just, it hurts when people say some of the things that they do on social media.
Well, I suppose that the most difficult time was in Brazil when I was burnt. My effigy was burnt.
Oh my goodness! Yes,
and I was hiding inside of a building as a large and loud crowd was chanting terrible things and burning this effigy. But there was another larger and more raucous crowd that was defending my right to speak and to
I'm glad.
That didn't make the news as much, but those were a beautiful group of people from all walks of life. And, I get certain kind of media attention when I'm attacked like that, and I understand why. But, I think of people like Mireille Franco, who was a Black lesbian government official in Rio, who was gunned down for her positions on gay and lesbian rights and feminist principles, and in particular Black feminism. And maybe we know her story, but maybe we don't. It worries me sometimes that I get the attention because my name is a little overdetermined, but there are many other stories. The young activists in Romania, the radical feminists in Argentina and Chile. These people suffer threats, and they also are enormously powerful in their worlds. And many people are watching the kinds of broad social movements that they have been able to organize and enliven. And so, it's important for me to remember it's not about me, I'm standing in for a movement, or I'm standing in for a trend of thought. It's not this person who's alive still.
What inspired you to write Gender Trouble? And then were you surprised by the response that people had to it?
Yes. I was pretty angry in some feminist meetings that happened in the mid-'80s, where every time we talked about women, we assumed they were straight and that they were mothers. I went through the roof.
Done with that.
I always thought feminism meant that you could explore who you want to love and how you want to love, and you might have children, you might not, and those were equally valuable. There are different ways of living, and because I followed Simone de Beauvoir's idea that you could be born a gender, you could be born a bit up and called a certain sex at birth, that didn't really determine what you would become. So for me, that gap, like what I'm called and what I become, that was a space of freedom. That was a space of social movement. That was, well, what can I do? What can I be? How can I live and love? And with whom can I make my most fundamental connections in life? And maybe they take the form of family, but maybe they take the form of friendship or community or kinship more broadly. So that was really important to me. And it actually felt like life itself depended on those fundamental connections of people who would be there for one another, especially when they had been shoved out of their families or abandoned or made to suffer in the larger world. We were there for each other. And that was confirmed for me in the AIDS crisis in the US, when so many communities built societies and what we would call mutual aid societies now. And it's impressive to me now under pandemic conditions, the networks of people who are there for each other, who may not be in the same household, who may not have any legal relation to one another, but they catch each other when they fall. They They are there to help with food or shelter or to fight the eviction notice. This is just the most important thing. So I really felt that queer kinship, is what I called it back then, was the way to both incorporate the family and move beyond it to other ideas of what essential ties were. So, it took me a little while to get there, but I certainly felt like my way of life and even my way of loving was not acknowledged by certain forms of feminism, and that we had much to learn from those who are gender queer and gender nonconforming, that they were showing us that gender itself could be expansive as a category, and we shouldn't assume we know what men are and what women are. Part of what feminism should be is putting that into question. What is a woman, right? What is a man?
Right.
What could
Well, and even just like I love what you say. What about the families that we choose of affiliation and care and you're right. We see. I love that too. That we're seeing that now and in ways that people are helping each other in surprising ways. We
do choose some, and we're maybe born into others. But there's a kind of third category. It's like the people you stumble through life with.
Completely.
Did I choose this?
Right, you're thrown into it.
And we're doing this together, and this is where I am,
Yes, thrownness. In one of the introductions to one of your books, you mention just like the violence of gender norms, just like your family experience of that growing up. And I wonder if you can talk more about it. You mentioned your uncle in one of them, and if it's too private, then just we'll move right along. But I did want to ask about it because I always, I read that sentence and I was worried about your uncle, and I wondered, how things turned out in the end. And but anyway, like I said, if you want to skip, you can definitely skip.
No, it's okay. I had an uncle I never met, and I didn't understand why that was the case. And I was told that he was in the middle of the country somewhere. I grew up in Ohio, and he was apparently somewhere else, maybe Kansas. And then it turned out that he was in an institute and had been consigned there, in part because he had what they called problems of sexual development. So undeveloped testes, and then a set of behaviors that followed, in part because he was being inspected all the time, right? He was being diagnosed and inspected, and would he ever become normal, and did they have to hide him? And there was a kind of terribly panicked relationship to his body, which didn't have the exact same genital form as everybody else's, but he was apparently a very kind person, and unfortunately I never got to know him. But he was institutionalized and set apart from society, I think in part because of my family's shame and their inability to work with him and love him and affirm him in his difference. And he died there without me ever knowing, and with some of us at least never understanding the full story until after he was gone.
Yeah. I do think of your work and its relation to the trans community, and I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that. I can imagine you've gotten letters over the years from people who really found a lot of hope in your writing and your work, and I can imagine that coming out of that experience as a child too. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that, like what your work has meant personally for people who are having different gender expressions and experiences.
Well, I think it's gone two ways. I mean, on the one hand, there have surely been trans people who felt that gender trouble opened up the possibility of establishing a new social reality for themselves. This phrase, gender is performative.
Yes, yeah.
Some have said, oh, that means it's fake. It's just a role. It's just, it's an artifice. And there's a kind of more important meaning to it, which is that as we move through historical shifts, what seems to be the wrong way of doing gender, or maybe even the fake way of doing gender, becomes a new social reality, and it achieves a kind of reality and dignity of its own. So some trans people said, no, my gender is not performative. This is my reality. And at that point, I saw that some people thought performative meant unreal.
Right,
So I
right.
go back and try to work it through again to make sure that I was properly recognizing trans people for who they are, the social reality they live, which is very different from the name and the sex that they were assigned at birth, and that's a really important form of recognition. It's an ethical requirement, and of course, added to that is the fact that I always felt that I was outside of gender norms, and like I don't know which one. I'm in between. So when non-binary came along as a category, I just felt very happy. I had, there was a category for me.
Yeah, I would love if you could talk a little bit more about that, and just like, when did that come into being in your life, and just how it's been. I mean, I have a few non-binary people in my life, and I guess what I want to know is like the history of non-binary experience and understanding oneself in that way, in the way that we do now. Do you know what I mean? It just, when I talk to young people these days, the language that they use for these categories of human experience just seems so much more advanced than the categories that I grew up with, or that I understand in a natural way. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Just how did we get to where we are now?
Well, again, it kind of depends in what time and place we're talking, because, we're talking about a set of terms in English, and there are other terms in French and in Spanish and in
Oh, that's
Portuguese,
right. Of
and
course.
also in Japan, a number of ways of thinking about the performance of gender, which has very, very complicated uh, lexicons and verbs and inflections of verbs associated with it. So, if we want to give a global assessment, we have to actually look at all the languages, and also the difficulty of translating between, say, English and others, and the importance of not assuming that everything we discover in English is therefore true for the rest of the world.
Right. That's so true. You're right.
Right?
Exactly.
We
Or
have
that
to,
other cultures don't have those ideas built into them already.
or they
Um,
have a whole other set of descriptions.
right.
May
Right.
not be identities, right?
Yes,
I've always,
completely.
I could call myself, I give myself an identity. I can live within that category. And I'm willing to do that for all kinds of reasons. But, um, but I'd much rather tell a story. I'd much rather give you a description. I would much rather show you a film. you know, I,
Yeah.
I think we put so much on the categories of identity that we sometimes lose the texture of the life. And the texture of a life, like what happened to me, where I got here, what I called myself, how I changed it, how I began to ask others to call me by this pronoun rather than another. That's a particular arc of a life. And that's maybe we could say that's summarized by the identity category, but we could also say it's maybe effaced or abbreviated by the identity
That's
category.
interesting. Of course, there's something that's lost
Yeah.
when we don't hear the full story, and we have that marker to identify you. That's so interesting.
So
Yeah.
I think there are a wide range of definitions of non-binary. I don't think there is one, and I think that's one of the things that makes it interesting and important. But I would say that at the time that I wrote Gender Trouble, I was thinking, oh, well, I want to get beyond the binary. Why does it have to be man, woman? Aren't there other vocabularies? And I think I asked that question toward the end. That would be
Yep, you did.
32 years ago or whatever. Um, um, but I didn't understand that non-binary could become a category at that point.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I think it's a way of saying I am neither fully this nor fully that, and that I have a certain constitutive distance or question about how I am in relation to those categories. They affect me. I surely embody them in partial ways, but they don't capture me, and maybe no category would, not even non-binary.
Right, right. Oh, that's a lovely answer to that question. Thank you very much. We just saw that on January 6th, the U.S. Capitol was overrun by a mob of people, and I'm obviously reading it in the course with your book in mind, The Force of Nonviolence, and I wonder if you can. It's funny because I was just reading the section about aggressors claiming to be persecuted. That section, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what happened, and it's just what connections you see between that and your book, The Force of Nonviolence.
Well, it's funny that The Force of Nonviolence came out in January 2020, and then there was the pandemic, and then there was the reemergence of a Black Lives Matter movement, or
right, of course,
a movement for Black lives, which focused on the lethal violence wielded by police against Black and brown people disproportionately, as we know. And then the pandemic also made us feel, whether we wanted to or not, fairly interconnected with other parts of the globe, right? That our very life depends on the conduct of other people, not just here, but elsewhere, and that we are connected, that we're equally vulnerable, could come and affect all of us, or even possibly take our lives, as it has taken so many lives, or landed us with long-term illnesses, as we know. In a way, we were more interconnected and interdependent. The virus doesn't care about national boundaries. It doesn't discriminate racially, although the social policies that handle the virus certainly do. So on the one hand, we're interconnected, and there's a certain utopian function that opens up, and then there are these massive social inequalities, many of which are racial inequalities or inequalities based on wealth, that make us see, even in a more glaring way, just how terrible and intensifying these hierarchies are. So it's been a time of kind of wondering if this will open up into a hopeful scene, or seeing just how entrenched something like systemic racism is. Yeah. And of course, Black Lives Matter and the movements against police violence, the movements against racism, were also saying, look, these lives are grievable. You can't just take this life. We are out here not only saying that George Floyd we grieve him, he ought not to have died. No one should die by police violence of this sort. And so there was a grieving, but also an anger that emerges from the grief, which is mobilizing. And I think we don't perhaps reflect enough about how anger against preventable death can move us to hold to certain kinds of demands for equality and for the right of people to live their life without it being preemptively cut short by preventable illness or by police violence. And the Black and brown communities in this country were seeing both police violence and preventable death at the same time. It was a doubly intensified sense that our lives are not worth saving or protecting or valuing. And that was, I think, extremely mobilizing. And that mobilization was by and large a nonviolent one. Yeah. Because it did not want to reproduce the violence of the world that it opposes, right? You can't oppose a certain kind of violence and then reproduce it in your practice.
Right,
because then you're involved in a revenge, or you want others to feel the pain that you felt. I will do to you what you did to me. But, first of all, I don't think those communities have the police power or the ability to get away with violence in the way that the police do. But also, I think that there was a coming together and an insistence on the value of life, and a demand, especially that young people of color and young Black men and young Black women too should be living in a world in which they can expect to live. They're not afraid of their lives being snuffed out at a corner store.
The word grievable is something, that the more I live with that word, the more appropriate it seems. But I wonder if you can talk about, when you're thinking about just different alternatives, like the language of, like, say, human dignity or some other language, like, what made you gravitate toward that expression of human inequality and racism and discrimination, et cetera?
Well, I'll just give you three brief examples for me. I think when it started for me, when I was young, and if I loved somebody and I lost that person, I could not say out loud that I am going through this loss, because I was never supposed to have loved that person. There was no public acknowledgement for my love, nor was there public acknowledgement for my loss. Yes. Which is a recipe for what Freud calls melancholia, right? There's
right.
no language to acknowledge my loss. There's no externalization of it. In reality, I'm living with it in a kind of psychic form that takes me away from the world and makes me feel unconnected and unvalued. But so I talked a little bit about that during the intensification of AIDS in the United States, when I felt that many people were taking to the streets in order to proclaim their love and their loss. This is my loss, acknowledge my loss.
Yes.
Do not treat my love and loss as shameful.
Yes.
I'm going to mark it, you're going to mark it, the world is going to mark it.
Yes.
We're going to learn those names and we're going to recite those names.
Right. You're going to see that quilt, and you're going to see how big it is, and you're going to see how much sadness I'm carrying with me as I go to Washington to
and that I publicly proclaimed this love without shame.
Yeah.
But, it seemed to me that also in 9/11, we grieved certain people who were lost in the World Trade Center, but we didn't really grieve the queers, and we didn't grieve the non-citizens or people who were undocumented. There were many people who remained ungrieved, and then when we started bombing, we didn't give a list of those names. They didn't get summaries in the New York Times. Their lives were not worth narrating in detail. We didn't want to know their favorite color or what the name of their dog was. We didn't do that for them. So then you see that part of how nationalism works and how racism works as well is to act as if certain lives are worth protecting and safeguarding, and that they are the ones that should not be lost. And if they are lost, we grieve. And others who are sort of, maybe they're not really living, maybe they're not really lives, maybe they're not really humans. And when they're lost, what's lost? Nothing's lost. They were already lost before they were lost. And that's a vicious and horrifying formulation. That's how the difference between the grievable and the ungrievable work. And you see that it is already a hierarchy of value. Who has value, who does not. Yeah. That's radical inequality, which is why radical equality would be the equal grievability of all human lives. And then we would have to add to that, well, animals, other living processes, the earth.
Right. One of my favorite lines in the book, it's on page 57. You say, most forms of violence are committed to inequality. It's just like such an obvious thing that I just never thought about in quite that way before. When I was in college, a lot of my friends took classes with Michael Nagler, his nonviolence class, and they would. I ended up buying the reader for it and reading it on my own. I wonder if you can talk about just kind of like how your thinking on nonviolence kind of connects to like Satyagraha, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Michael Nagler, just that world.
Well, it certainly connects with Gandhi. And I could have written much more on Gandhi, but then it would have been a book on Gandhi. So I actually had to decide, how does my view differ from Gandhi's, and why do I want to do a separate project? Yeah. And I think the way it differs is that I it's funny. It's mixed, but I think that like Gandhi, I'm not particularly interested in passivity. He made a distinction between
Right.
passive resistance
Right.
and nonviolence. He thought, in fact, that nonviolence had a force in it.
Active.
Uh,
Exactly.
and so he is, of course, implicitly cited in the um, in the title. I mentioned um, in the opening pages for that reason. At the same time, I think that I accept that we do live with both love and hatred. Uh, that to become nonviolence is not about becoming uh, only loving or
Mm.
purely loving. I think that hatred and aggression are part of our psychic constitution, and that it falls on us to decide how we live that. Um, do we craft that into nonviolent forms, or do we act on that immediately and thoughtlessly? Um, I don't think we're bad if we're aggressive. I don't even think we're bad if we hate, but there's another order of reflection. What do we do with our aggression? What do we do with our hate? Can it be cultivated?
Yeah.
Can it become a form of resistance? For instance, people want to tear down prisons. It's an act of destruction. It's an act of dismantling. Um, and there is something about that dismantling which I think, well, that's a nonviolent call. The abolition movement is objecting to prisons because they are forms of institutionalized violence. And when we want to take it down, we want to take down institutionalized violence. So how do we name that taking down, that dismantling, that abolition? It's a negation. For sure, but it's not violent. It's a nonviolent dismantling in the name of anti-violence.
Right.
So,
Right.
I think it's nonviolence is not some place where we retreat in our soul, where we feel pure equilibrium. It's a
Yes.
fight. It's a deep
Yeah.
struggle. Like how do I live this anger? How do I live this
Yeah,
rage?
you speak so compellingly about that, and just the way we carry the ways that we haven't been loved ourselves. And it was in the section that you were talking more about psychoanalysis, and I wonder if you can talk about just like what psychoanalysis means to you, and just like where psychoanalysis is, because I think what Freud meant to me in 1988 and what Freud means to me now has really changed. And I think it's partly just like the world's circumstances, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that part of your thought in general, psychoanalysis, and what it gets you in terms of your ability to understand social systems in the world.
Well, when Freud wrote to Einstein in the teens of the 20th century,
Yes.
um, or Einstein wrote to him first, actually,
Right.
um, and the big question was, look, there's this destructive potential that we see in human life, and how can we build a society when humans are destructive, maybe naturally destructive? And Freud didn't know exactly how to respond. He recognized that fragility, um, and he thought maybe there was a kind of destructive power, or even a drive that he came to call the death
Yeah, the
drive
will to death. Yeah.
6 years later, um, that was destructive, and that it did need to be addressed in some way. Um, but I think I think it's important to recognize that fully, not to feel like, oh, I'm going to diminish that part of me, or I'm going to set that aside and act as if humans are fundamentally loving or fundamentally altruistic. No, they do have that, and there's no question about it. But it's a struggle, which is where ethics comes in. Um, I want to
Yeah.
destroy, but I do not want to destroy.
Right. Right. On
I,
page 51, you mentioned theologians in the nonviolence book. And I wonder if you see theologians as an important force in today's movements for human liberation. I just wonder what your thoughts are on the whole discipline of theology.
well, I absolutely do. I think that there are theological questions at work when we ask, for instance, how to make sense of this world in light of the pervasive destruction that we know, that we see, that we experience, we know from history, and that we see coming at us again.
Yeah.
Is this inevitable? Is this just a pattern that will repeat, and that we accept that? And it is an overwhelming phenomenon, but I think that it is, every time it arrives, a challenge. How do I meet this destruction without destroying in return? Even though I'm furious.
Yes, exactly. Want to destroy.
Especially at the moment of fury, especially at that very moment of fury when I could destroy everything, precisely to check myself and ask myself, what kind of world do I want to live in? And will my action help me to produce that world, or will it make it worse? Will I be postponing that world through acting in this way?
Yeah.
And it's an existential theological question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think when I was young, all I read in high school was existential theology. It was the only thing I read. It was Kierkegaard and existential theology.
Yes, yes.
But it's still with me. I believe it is.
Yeah, same with me. The things I read when I was 16 are hugely formative for what I'm still thinking about now. I've been the worst host in the world. I feel like this has been like a dinner party. I've like cornered you in the corner. There's like a zillion other people who are asking us questions. And so it's part of our practice to ask questions from the audience. So, and one of the most poignant ones that just came through for me is, have you written about the experience of your uncle? I have a similar experience in my family. So I know that's the one I wanted to just get to right away. But if you have like a citation for where that person can go and look for more on that, I think they'd really appreciate it.
I mentioned it in the most recent preface to Gender Trouble.
Yeah, that's where I read it.
I did write something on it, but I have lost that text.
Yeah.
And I gave it publicly in 1989 or 90 or something, maybe even earlier. And I never been able to find it. But if I do, I'll post it somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. I could imagine that. Okay, so today is International Women's Day. What does it stand for today? What was it meant to stand for? And what should it stand for now and into the future? Does it need marketing or endorsements?
No, it doesn't need marketing or endorsements.
Okay, good. That's clear that.
That would be the end of the feminist movement. But look, it's a really important day, and for at least 4 reasons. And we have to remember that women are disproportionately illiterate. When we look at who is illiterate, women are more likely to be illiterate than men. Who experiences sexual violence domestically, on the street, from police, from state actors, non-state actors, women disproportionately, and poverty. Women tend to be much more poor than men. So these forms of inequality are there, and they continue to be there. And they all have to be addressed, and they should be addressed ideally in a movement that deals with all those questions. At the same time, we're living in a world in which we have to keep the category of women open. It has to include trans women. It has to include all those who identify as women. And we need to keep that tent open, because feminism is committed to the idea that gender shifts historically. What it meant to be a woman at one time is not the same as what it means now. And if we believe that, as I surely do, and I think most feminists do, then we need to reach out to our trans allies and move forward in a broad alliance that would be anti-racist, anti-capitalist, trans-affirmative, and feminist in the most capacious way, socialist as well.
Yeah, so here's the next question. Could you speak to the intersection of nonviolence, LGBTQ rights, and religion? Are there spiritual practices that you find helpful in nurturing resilience and deepening your commitments? Do you pray, meditate, or engage in other disciplines? These questions are great.
It's asking a lot.
It is. Do you want me to go through it more slowly?
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna just say things that are odd. What gets me through, and what gets me through with others, is laughter. swimming. And swimming has a meditative dimension to it that is
Yes.
largely underrated, but you can lose a sense of time, and you also allow the mind to consider things that are, for the most part, kept back. It cleanses the mind. I practice yoga. I learn an enormous amount from the Iyengar tradition, although I feel like I continue to be a novice, even though I've been doing it for a very long time. And I belong to a synagogue, and the rituals and prayers are very important to me and move me very fundamentally. I feel like my Jewish tradition has given me a sense of justice and value, and it's helped to see some of those principles expressed by groups like Jewish Voice for Peace or Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. I ally with them. I feel very deeply connected. I believe in cross-religious dialogue. I find it extremely interesting. And I think that we need to not only respect religions, but realize that so many people have their basic values formed through their religious formation. And that if you take that away, you take the matrix of their values away. And we don't always consider that when we're talking to one another.
That's such a lovely answer to that question. That's so beautiful. And what a great question. What is the role of language in peace building?
Well, we can do injury with language. Language can be an instrument of harm.
Yeah.
Sometimes language can be violent. It's a specific kind of linguistic violence, but we need to accept that just because it's a word does not mean it is nonviolent.
Yeah.
We're told to use our words rather than our fists when we're young, but words can be searing and they can be very, very rough. So how do we assume responsibility for the potentially hurtful dimensions of our own language? I think in dealing with people with whom there are conflicts, you need to know not just how they call themselves, like their name, their pronoun, very important, but how they see themselves and where they come from. And we need to narrate our lives a little bit more before we start taking positions against each other. Because I think that one can get a different kind of perspective on the person with whom one is quarreling once you know a little bit more about their story.
One of my, I hate to answer your question for the person's question for you, but one of my favorite parts of your thought is just, it really made me kind of reevaluate just how language can constrain human freedom. And that's something I really appreciate about what you point out. And just in terms of that, you can't say radical things in a conservative grammar kind of thing. And that's not part of the answer to this question, but it is something that I appreciate about your thought. Okay, here's the next question. All right. On International Women's Day, are there women of history that speak to you in this moment especially? During the pandemic, people like Julian of Norwich have meant a great deal to me. They've also lived through a health crisis. What do you make of characters like Olympe de Gouges or Jane Fonda? Does feminism and queer movements need icons, heroines, or saints? So that's a lot. I think you could probably answer any of that and you'd win.
I think I might be frustrating in this way. Olympe de Gouges was a really important French feminist, maybe the avant la lettre. She had a revolutionary thought. Joan Scott, the historian, has written about her at length and taught me to understand the linguistic and political strategies with which she sought to enfranchise women. So someone like that, who's really smart, mischievous, subversive, and powerful, is great. Angela Davis is somebody who is our neighbor and our guiding light, and I always learn from her. I'm grateful to have lived during the same time as her and to hear her still and to see how powerful her influence has been on so many movements and moving us to think transnationally and transregionally as well. I think a lot about her courage and her strength.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought her up because, I mean, she's somebody who's just been such a bedrock. And yet, I wonder if we take her for granted because she is our neighbor. And I'm glad that you reminded us to pay attention and listen and give thanks for the people who are around us, because she's a huge blessing in our life. And
It's a huge
and
blessing.
I can imagine, like, reading her obituary in the newspaper. Well, I never do that, but just being glad to be reminded of just what one person can do is extraordinary.
Well, and what she continues to do in Palestine or in Brazil or in Turkey, I mean, wherever you go, and in South Africa, her influence is enormous. And she thinks globally as well. I mean, she's right there in Oakland, but she's thinking globally and putting it together in a way that's a great model for all of us.
It's true. Have you written about Japanese gender complexity, and how does this relate to the stereotypes of a culture?
I have visited Japan twice, and I've learned a fair amount from people I meet there. I've not written about it, although I have written maybe a little bit about verb forms and the fact that gender is not a noun, right? You wouldn't say, what's your gender? This is my gender. What gender is this person? Under what category do I put this person? Gender is inflected through verbs and through modes of address. So it's not a separate entity. It's not even a discernible adjective. It comes up in the course of a linguistic exchange, and it's relational. So I'm very interested in it, but I don't speak Japanese, so I don't really feel like I have the grounds to advance a very complicated thesis about it.
We have so many questions. We're going to keep you for the next 4 hours. Actually, we can't, though, because we're running out. It's 6:57. I just can't believe how fast time's flown by. But I didn't want to leave without asking you about just like 2 questions. The first is, what surprised you about the Trump years, and what did it confirm about what you already thought? And then what signs of hope do you see, as we're going forward? And I think that's all we have time for, unfortunately. We'll have to have you next time when you do the next book.
Yeah. I think maybe what I would say about the Trump years is that at first we were all just shocked by the crude and crass man and his way of speaking and his hateful remarks about women, about Mexicans, about Muslims. And I think now, as he's fading, and I hope he fades forever, we are seeing that actually he was a vehicle for a white supremacy that has never left this country.
Right.
It's a resurgent white supremacy. It's a new form. He gave it new form. He gave it new possibility. He gave it permission.
Yes.
But this is as old as the country itself. It's not new, even if it has a new form, and that it is perhaps the deepest issue that we have to face as we think forward about who we are, what we want to become, how we want to define this country. Today, I was speaking with some colleagues from Mexico who said that there were people who thought you have to keep the foreigners out because otherwise the core of the country would be threatened or it would disappear in time. But of course, the welcoming of the foreigner or the opening of the border is the ethical core of this country.
Yes, exactly.
Its capacity to open its border is the most beautiful part. And that's the part we need to value as we dismantle those walls.
Yeah, exactly. And signs of hope for the future.
In the mutual aid societies and the networks of care, I see people reaching out to each other across all kinds of lines. It's not just in the family that we find the systems of care. It's not just among women. We find them across regions and across geographies that show that we are interconnected on this earth. And that means that as we struggle to survive this virus, we also will be struggling in the future to save this earth and the ecological conditions of our persistence here on earth. So that comes to the fore. The pandemic can help us to think about climate change and what our ethical and political obligations are going forward.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Judith. It's been such a pleasure having you. Somewhere you wrote that your aim was to make life more livable for people on the sexual margins, and that's just such a profound ministry. It's such a blessing to so many people. And we're so grateful for you being here tonight, but just grateful for your overall mission in the world, and that you remind us that every life is grievable, and how important that is.
Thank you, Malcolm. It's been a pleasure for me and a great honor to be part of Grace Cathedral, this magnificent institution in our world. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And for everybody else, please join me next week when our guests will be Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm. They're the co-directors of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, and they're creators of the multimedia project Journey of the Universe. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give on gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK to 76278. And again, thank you so much, and bless you as you start to come out of this terrible COVID, and I look forward to seeing you in person. Good night, everyone.